So what do you got written down over there?
So I heard a good podcast, but I forgot. Oh wait, actually, another good topic is James Gunn.
The director?
Yeah. And then I heard a different one, but I forgot what sparked it. But it was about globalization.
Was it the one that Sam Harris and What's His Bucket did, or the one with like?
Yeah. So Sam Harris and Ian Bremmer did a podcast.
I heard that one.
That one was good, and then there was a different one in the fifth column
I heard
where
that
they
one
also
too.
talked a little bit about globalization.
Yeah.
But I forgot what sparked that conversation because there wasn't anything in the news, but it's still relevant. It kind of just it all plays together right now. But another good one that I think we can get a lot out of is that Sarah Young tweets, where she tweeted like all these things about
That
white people.
Bitch.
Yeah.
Is it the one that I was telling you about last night that I kind of got into a fight with somebody about?
A little bit. I don't know if it was that girl in particular, Sarah Young, but she's basically saying all these things about white people. Can't wait for white
How
people
they're
to
the
die,
devil?
blah, blah, blah. Yeah, exactly.
Hold on, what was her name? Sarah Young?
Yeah, Sarah, and then last name is Jeong.
Oh, popped right up.
Yeah.
Didn't even have to.
She's made quite a name for herself.
It's just doing all the top stuff. Let's look for people. Is she that Asian chick?
Yeah.
Okay. Senior writer at Verge, soon to be editor and board at the New York Times, law and technology stuff. Sarah Young, The Verge.
Oh yeah, I don't know if you know who Ben Dominish is, but
Uh-uh.
he has a podcast called The Federalist Hour.
Never listened to it.
It's a good one. You should check it out.
Okay.
But he's a little more right wing, pretty conservative. He's married to what's her name? John McCain's daughter.
Oh.
Sarah.
I don't remember, but
Anyway, but he's married to John McCain's daughter. Anyway, he's pretty right wing, kind of conservative, kind of standard conservative. But he was on the fifth column, and they brought up this point about like the new Vietnam syndrome. With what's going on with all the wars and stuff like that. And I think that's what sparked the populism versus globalization debate. So we can talk about that.
Okay. This is so ironic that she's talking about how white people are, like, terrible.
Did you see her tweets?
Yeah, I was just reading.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, Asians are doing better statistically than any other race in the United States.
Yeah.
So why is she like, white people are the devil?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can start recording, but that's...
I've already started.
Oh, you
Easy
already
target.
started?
Yeah, I just figured that way I can make sure that it's picking up
Oh, okay.
our voices.
Gotcha. But yeah, that was everybody's argument, is how you... One, those tweets that she made are extremely racist. How are you going to say, I can't wait for white people to die, and all these things, and then come back with the argument that, oh, actually, I can't be racist towards white people because they're systemically the oppressors of everybody else. And systemic racism is only, oppression against the non-dominant race, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically her argument, and everybody on the left's argument, apparently, because I didn't know this was going on, but apparently this is what racism means now.
Is her argument like the dominant race in the United States? Because if we're talking globally, Asians are the dominant race.
Yeah, no, but she means in the United States.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's... The left, I don't know. Obviously, the left is kind of an umbrella term, but the new left, I guess you could say, is just redefining every word in the dictionary to fit their purposes. And it's kind of funny to watch. It's kind of analogous to, the heresy hunts of, the early Catholic Church, right? Where one day, and not even that early, but, this was also kind of analogous to the heresy hunts of the Soviet Union, where, okay, they picked up a stream of thought, and all of a sudden, if you weren't following that stream of thought, right, if you weren't submitting to that stream of thought, you were a heretic. And this is what the new left has done. They've totally redefined what racism is so that they can modify it and modulate it any way they see fit, and then if you're not, acquiescing to what they deem to be racism, then you're now branded a racist, right? And so, yeah, how are you going to redefine racism as systemic oppression of people? That is just the most vacuous statement on the planet.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah, like I said, I was just reading her tweets, and I'm like, seriously? Like,
Yeah.
Like, where do you... Like, what gives you the backbone to do that?
Yeah, and then the double standard, right? This is obviously racism, and
Mhm.
anybody with any sort of reasonableism is going to see this as racism, right? And so, and the New York Times, instead of coming out and saying she apologized, and if she put out an actual apology, right?
Yeah, and I saw that they had like a statement or something.
Yeah,
like
some
that.
half-assed statement where it says, "We stand by Sarah Young. She's a great Asian journalist, blah blah blah, and she regrets her tweets." And that's it. That was basically the extent of their apology. And she didn't really apologize for it. She said that the reason why she put out these tweets was because she was being trolled for being an Asian reporter, and that she had to come out in defense of herself and then post all these things about Asian people, or white people, sorry.
Yeah.
So that was her defense, and the New York Times basically bought it and said, "Oh, we stand with Sarah, and we think she's going to be a
their
great
exact
editor."
statement was, "We hired Sarah Young because the exceptional work she has done covering the internet and technology at a range of respected publications. Her journalism and the fact that she is a young Asian woman have made her a subject of frequent online harassment. For a period of time, she responded to that harassment by imitating the rhetoric of her harassers. She sees now that this is approach only to be served to feed the virtual that too often..." I can't read, this print is super small. "That we too often see on the social media. She regrets it, and the Times does not condone it. We had candid conversations with Sarah as part of our thorough vetting process, which included a review of her social media history. She understands that this type of rhetoric is not acceptable at the Times, and we are confident that she will be an important voice for the editorial board moving forward." Okay, that was super small print, but yeah, that's ridiculous. They're defending her.
Yeah, and that's a total double standard. Imagine if she had said this about black people.
Oh yeah.
She would have
The
been
streets would be
the
on
most
fire.
ostracized person on the planet. She would have been essentially blacklisted and been left to write for Breitbart or whatever other publication that's just on the fringes, right? But she is at the world's leading publication, right? Every world leader reads the New York Times, even Trump, right? Even as much as he calls it the fake news, as much as he hates it, he still reads it. Obviously, he still reads it. And this is the world's leading magazine, and they're basically condoning her tweets and saying, "Oh yeah, well, we bought her argument," right? And this is a total double standard, and we need to take back the word racism to actually mean something. Because if it doesn't mean what we traditionally want it to mean, right, then I'm totally lost. I don't know what racism is, and I don't have a good enough word to describe actual racists. People like Richard Spencer, right? People like Jared Taylor, right? Classic white supremacists that are masquerading as racists, right? But that's what I can't stand is this double standard that if you say something bad about white people, you can kind of get away with it if you're an Asian, if you're a black person, or whatever.
I even think there's parameters with that. Like I said, if you are a straight, heterosexual, or Christian white male, you can be the target, and anything that you say about that person is not considered racism. But yet, if that person says anything negative about anybody else, it's essentially racist, homophobic, whatever, because if you're saying something against a white person that's gay, all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, you're homophobic. So even then, I feel like there's still parameters of this whole racism. It's like, only these white people here are what's, I think, you can call not racist actions. Because even if you say something against a white woman, you're like, oh, well, you're sexist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's labels that they put on everything.
Yeah.
So.
And this is the stratification of sort of identity politics, right? It's just how victimized can you be, and how many points do you get for being just of a certain identity group, right? So at the bottom of the list, you get no points, you get negative points, you're basically kicked out of the group, is straight white males. Everything you're just at the bottom here at identity politics, and it just goes up the ladder, right?
Yeah.
More victimized are white women, gays, and then you get into people of color, black people, and then Asians, whatever it is, right? And so we can't continue to play this game of identity politics, right? We have to figure out, or we have to cement what we actually mean by racism. And I don't like the way that the left is taking what they deem to be racism, right? Because
they're essentially creating a culture, a victim culture.
Yeah.
And I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, that's
but no, that's the new left. I feel like you're exactly right. They're just creating a victim culture, and you're exactly right. You get points if you meet certain criteria.
Yeah.
Sorry, but continue with your point.
No, but yeah, this is what's so funny about this. There's no reasonable position to get here. Once you basically admit, or once you start following that line of thought, everything falls apart here, right? Their reasoning isn't based on actual reasonable positions, right? So all you need to grant them is the mere fact that identity politics is a thing, and then from there everything just goes chaotic, right? There's no stopping the heresy hunts. There's no stopping the apostasies. It's a new religion basically, and nobody's quite figured it out, and they're all different denominations, and they're just vying to be on top, right? Because okay, an Asian woman calls out a white person. Some on the left would go, oh yeah, that's fine. Other people on the left would go, well, are you saying all white women and gay white people, right? Like, there's no stopping just how many identities you can latch onto, and essentially being a victim all the way down. And this is what's so unreasonable. But to bring up another point, we're all playing this game without ever agreeing to actually play this game, right? We're now forced to acquiesce to their demands, and I didn't participate. I didn't want to participate, but now
you're forced to walk on the
yeah,
eggshells.
exactly, yeah. And so this is what I was talking to Kelly about yesterday. I think it was if I reach a position of some modicum of power, or manager, or somewhere in this new company that I'm at, right? What happens if they scroll through my Twitter? Right, I get fired in an instant. Right, I said things about Islam that wouldn't mesh well with standard political correctness. Right, I'd be fired. They'd be telling me to clear up my desk just in an instant. Right, and so we're all playing this game, and none of us agreed to it, and it's just the fringe that is driving this entire movement.
Well, that's sad, because you should have the freedom to say those things, and not have to worry about any type of repercussion, either financially or physically, or any type of abuse of any kind, because you should be protected in order to be able to say whatever you believe, as long as, like I said, you're not calling for violence.
Exactly. Well, it doesn't even have to be a call for violence, right? I can distinguish pretty easily between bigotry, racism, right? The two words are kind of synonymous here, but it doesn't take a genius to distinguish between actual bigotry and racism versus the positions that I've taken, especially considered Islam, right? But somehow the left has just lost sight that Arabs and Muslims are just idiosyncratic. There's no difference between them.
They fall under that umbrella.
Yeah, and so the things that I've said about Islam would just be viewed as anti-Arab bigotry according to their standards, right? So that's where I could potentially fall into some trouble. And yeah, you're right. We shouldn't have a financial cost to whatever it is that we're saying if it's not obvious. If it's just like a joke or an opinion, right? If it's obviously not bigotry and racism, right? So take James Gunn for an example. That's why I wrote him down. James Gunn said a few jokes, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, that they're not funny jokes. A lot of them were like, okay, a little crazy.
A little off the cuff.
Yeah, but still, they were jokes. And he lost his job, right, as director of Guardians of the Galaxy, because a few people and this wasn't on the left, it was actually on the right. Mike Cernovich found these tweets. But he lost his job and potentially millions of dollars because of these old jokes that he said. And this is the game that we're all playing now, and it's just, we were just kind of co-opted into it without ever agreeing to play this game, right? So yeah.
Interesting. I don't even know what he said. I didn't even know anything about James Gunn.
So James Gunn a few years ago said, he was basically saying some jokes about kids, like all this. He was watching, I think one of the tweets that I remember, he was watching The Expendables, right? He's like, all this masculinity in The Expendables, I'm gonna go fuck a child or something like that.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's somewhere along the lines where he's making jokes about kids, right? Like where he's just I think one of them was like, he's gonna fuck a kid or something like that, right? But it was obviously a joke,
Sure.
right? And so, yeah, I don't think you should lose your job for just making jokes. I've said a lot of jokes that are off the cuff, right? I've said a lot of jokes that I probably wouldn't say in very public audiences, right? Just amongst the most close friends of mine, right?
Yeah,
But,
I know your audience type thing.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But he said it on Twitter, public platform,
Mm-hmm.
and he got pilloried for it, and eventually lost his job. And this is the world that we all have to navigate through now.
I mean, Trump, same thing happened to him with the whole grab him by the pussy.
Yeah,
You know, he thought he was just kind of talking with some buddies and making some jokes. And let's face it, everybody's said stupid shit like that before.
Yeah.
But during the campaign, apparently nothing was off limits.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know, just it seems like everything you say now is basically documented and recorded, and it's going to come back and bite you in the ass at some point.
yeah. And the Trump thing is interesting because everybody was basically calling him a sexist, and he does have sexist behavior, right? He
Oh,
does
yeah, no doubt.
think less of women, but yeah, like I said, like even at my old job, we would just get together and talk and shoot the shit, and there were things that were being said that I was like, okay, well that's, you know, obviously if you were saying it, you know, if you're trying to be politically correct, we're kind of derogatory towards women. But just being in that scene, I know that the guys that I work with are not terrible people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like we never give people the benefit of the doubt, and we're always trying to find the next thing to just be outraged about. And we have to stop that behavior because people are losing their jobs, right? People are losing millions of dollars in the case of James Gunn, right? And it's sad to see that we're all now playing in this world that we didn't want to play in, right?
It got forced upon us.
Yeah.
Well, that's a nice, 15-minute introduction into probably what this podcast will pertain.
Yeah.
So, welcome to the Owl Podcast, folks. I'm Jameson. I'm here with Jerry.
Hello.
So, I'm sure you guys have heard, we kind of feel a little passionate about the whole freedom of speech, and you should be able to say whatever you want to say without fear of repercussion, obviously within some parameters.
Yeah.
But, anyway, we'll go from here. Populism, I feel like people, when it comes to that, you can look at different politicians such as Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump even, to an extent, that those are very populist leaders or populist politicians. I guess, how do you view populism? How do you see, where people will get the appeal from it? What gives people that appeal? I mean, just what is populism to you, I guess?
Populism is, I guess, both on the left and the right, are ideas that politicians can always resort to. They're very universal. It's, economic safety.
Mm-hmm.
It's to get into the right and the left, sort of the homogenous nation state, right? There's foreigners coming into our land and they're degrading our values. So economics, your money's going away, and I'm here to save it, is a form of populism. Homogeneic societies, right? There's foreigners trying to take away your values, and we have to defend them. And that's kind of the two pillars of populism. And Trump and both Bernie Sanders played that card very hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bernie Sanders was promising economic stability. He was promising $15 an hour minimum. He was promising, free college. You're going to be debt free, and the state's all going to pay for it. Universal health care, just health care for everybody.
Socialism.
And essentially social. And Trump was promising not socialism, but he was promising a form of economic populism, right? And he was also promising a sort of national identity, right? We have immigrants from Syria, basically anti-Muslim, saying they're coming into this country, and who knows what's going to happen when they come into this country, right? We have Mexicans and Latin Americans basically coming up and taking your jobs, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So that plays into both national identity and economics, because if the Mexicans are stealing your job and the Muslims are coming in and they want to establish Sharia, then basically the United States doesn't mean anything, right? And a lot of his rhetoric was, a country without a wall, a country without a border, right? It's just basically not a country, right? So
sure.
That's what populism is, and these are very...
Well, that also sounds like a little mix of globalism in there too.
Well, globalism is the opposite of that. Globalism is the, and before I get into global, so
Yeah, sorry, continue your thought
yeah,
process.
so that's what Trump and Bernie Sanders were arguing, right? They were saying, we're here to protect your jobs, you're going to make more money, and we're going to keep the migrants away, and it's just the United States is just going to thrive based on the policies that we implement domestically, right?
Mhm.
And so now to get into globalism, globalism is the idea that borders mean less and less if we really look at them, right? And globalization is the idea that we can build a global market and we can just trade freely amongst nations, right? The integration of people should be seamless from other countries, right? So, if I want to trade with China and they want to send people, right, that shouldn't be a problem, right? So we're basically expanding out and trying to trade with everybody because trade is mutually beneficial, right? We should allow people to move between borders without really paying too much attention to what they're actually doing. So that's, in a nutshell, what globalization is.
Okay, so how do you feel about that based on what you just described? Because I'll tell you how I feel about globalism. I see its benefits both financially and economically, as far as the free trade. Obviously, I think there's some benefits as far as exchanging of culture and exchanging of ideas and things like that. I think there's a lot of benefits that come with globalism, but that being said, I still feel like a nation without a border is not a nation at all. So I still feel like there needs to be borders between countries, but I do think that there still needs to be like things like free trade, um, exchange of ideas. I'm still for immigration. I just think that obviously need to go about it doing it the legal way as opposed to just like the European Union has it, where you can just go between countries without having to go through any type of customs, things like that. That's kind of how I feel about it. That's very nutshell version of it.
So how would you explain that to a Trump voter that is working in one of these old coal mining towns, or not even coal, yeah, let's say coal mining, right? Their jobs were lost to technology, and they think that Muslims are basically coming into America to implement Sharia, right? How would you explain? Because I feel like that is one of the biggest supporters of Donald Trump, and they were the ones that were against globalization, more for populist politics, and we're really just not seeing the benefits of a globalized society. So how would you kind of modify your argument or modulate your argument to explain that to them?
Well, I would say that the failures of globalism are almost always blamed on like free trade, immigration, and it's basically for the rising inequality. But is that really the right target to say? I mean, I think that technology does give the biggest rise in inequality, but at the same time, I think technology will also, in the long run, create more jobs than it destroys. And I think that that's probably hard to explain to somebody like that because they have such a short-sighted view of things. But
it's hard to have a long-term view if you just lost your job.
No, I agree.
And I understand that because it's hard to explain to somebody. So Neil Ferguson has a great TED Talk where he calls it the Great Convergence. Basically, the U.S. GDP has been rising steadily, right?
Sure.
It can decline at points, but it hasn't risen as dramatically as we've seen countries like China, India, Singapore, countries that have really just adopted free trade, adopted globalization. But theirs has skyrocketed exponentially, and what we see now is that convergence between third world countries and the United States, right, which was one of the first countries to adopt free trade and the principles of Adam Smith, capitalism, basically. And so it's hard to explain to people in coal country that have lost their jobs to industry, to technology, and people continue to lose their jobs to technology. It's hard to explain to them, hey, actually the world is much better, the world is much safer, but I know that you lost your job, but look at all these millions of Indians that are out of poverty, right? So it is difficult to explain that to them.
It is. And I think when it comes down to it, it's just the person has to have a heart in order to be able to see the big picture of things, but we're very, very self-focused because obviously everybody has their own self-interest, they have their own goals, their own ambitions, things like that. But I would just show them, like, you're better off with all these things coming. It's hard to see it now, but just you got to give it time. I don't know. It's very hard to explain to them, but I do honestly believe, like I said, that in the long run, their life will get better. It's just when you're going through like that hard patch, or you just lost your job, you're worried for your family, you're worried for your friends, you're worried for whomever, that they're not going to see the possible long-term benefits.
Yeah, true. And I think Steven Pinker brought this up in his book Enlightenment Now, but we also have a problem with wealth gap, where most of the wealth is going to a small percentage of people,
Sure.
and the wealth that the rest of us don't see. Right, our economy by all standards is growing and getting better, but we're not seeing a rise in pay. We're not seeing better opportunities. But most people have, and that wealth gap creates anxiety in societies, and that feeds into a lot of what drives populism, right? Is that people aren't better off, and what they hear from politicians like Trump and Bernie Sanders is that rhetoric that I'm here to help you, I'm here to actually take care of your jobs, right? And it's a very popular position. That's where the word populism comes from. But a lot of politicians, people like Hillary Clinton, weren't taking those positions. She had a very centrist position, saying, actually, let's be reasonable and stuff like that, and that's not popular, right? So
yeah, agreed. But it's people. They just like to look for ways to take the burden off themselves and to put it onto somebody else.
Yeah.
Which is why I think populism can't succeed in a lot of different areas. Bernie Sanders, for example.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's necessarily the best course of action, just because I'm the kind of person that's like, you got to make your own life. You can't depend on somebody else for it. But it's when you feel like you're sinking and you're looking for a life raft, and you see somebody out there throwing you the rope.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can see why people are drawn to those people. I just still don't think it's necessarily the best idea. And I'm not going to say that all populists out there have over-promised and under-delivered. I feel like a lot of them have, but I understand why people are lured to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, and then, a lot of the things that also drive populism is just the availability of information and how quickly people are to judge. And they see things like corruption amongst politicians. They see politicians that Congress hasn't done any meaningful legislation in a while, right? You have a lot of these news stories, and you think, well, just fuck it, let's just destroy the whole thing and see what happens, right? Because it's obviously not working for us, as middle class people, right? And this is just any typical Bernie Sanders or Trump voter, right? The system isn't working for us. Let's throw a wrench in the entire system. Let's watch it collapse, and hopefully, from those ashes, something good will happen, right? And that was the mentality of a lot of the things that were driving the popularity of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, right? Because the Bernie Sanders crew was wanting free healthcare, wanting free college, all these things.
You just keep throwing out the word free, people are going to be like,
yeah,
I like that.
It's a very popular opinion and a very popular position for people to adopt. And sadly, it's an illusion, but
socialism, I'll be flat out and say it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It is not ever going to work, and there's no examples out there of it actually working, no matter which country you point to. Sweden, Norway, those
aren't
countries,
socialist.
they're not socialist countries. No matter what people say, those are not socialist countries.
Yeah.
So, that's, I guess, one of the things that frightens me with populism is, look at what happened recently in New York, that she's like 28 years old. I'm drawing a blank on her name. I know she's Puerto Rican.
Oh, the lady that just won.
She's a Democratic Socialist, and she just won, and I feel like she won on a very populist stage.
Yeah.
And things like that scare me, because I'm like, you're thinking very selfishly, and that's what I feel like socialism is. It's a very selfish thought process.
Yeah.
Just because you feel like it's okay to take money from somebody else, you feel like it's okay to take somebody else's hard work and make it your own, and I'm not okay with that personally. So populism does scare me when it's something that I feel is very counterproductive like that. But on the flip side, Trump's populism scares me too. He was promising to make America great again, and I don't feel like he obviously can deliver on a lot of his promises.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you kind of asked me like how I would explain something like how I feel about globalization to a Trump supporter. How do you feel about globalization? What are your views on it? I mean, do you agree with how I felt about it? Do you have disagreements with what I say about it? How would you explain it?
Your summary was pretty much spot on with what I agree with. I think nations need to find borders, mostly for the one ideology that's out there that there are actually a few ideologies, but the most pressing one or the most salient one is obviously Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We need to be able to defend borders so that when ideas mesh or when ideas clash through the movement of people,
Mm-hmm.
right, we're able to properly vet, okay, well, we want these people, we don't want these people for obvious reasons, right? And to deny that Islam and secularism in the United States are just going to clash. There's absolutely no middle ground to give here, right? It's just you're deluding yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that Islamic society is any way going to integrate itself into the United States, right? It's either Islam gets implemented into the United States as its government, or secularism wins, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the two. And for those reasons, and obviously just the trade between countries, I think borders need to be properly defined, they need to be defended, and not just for the reason of Islam, right? Moving too many people through borders causes a national identity crisis. And we see this in Europe, and we see this in the United States, and this gave rise to populism, right? We saw the movement of African migrants, we saw the movement of Syrian refugees, and Far East migrants as well, moving and basically flooding all of Europe. And what you saw rise to was a very strong national identity and saying, we are losing our insert country here, we're losing our French values, we're losing our German values, we're losing our American values, right?
Mm-hmm.
That gives rise to that identity politics, to that populist identity, where it says, we're basically being inundated here, and Germany is no longer for Germans. Germany is now a country for Muslims.
Sorry, guys. We shall. Thank you. It's playing, so if you'd like to pick up where you left off.
Where were we?
We're
talking about
yeah,
the movement of people between borders, and an influx of people, too many people coming into your country, creates that national identity crisis, right? And we can segue into identity politics here if you want to. But too many people, let's say you're in Germany, right? And what happened in Germany, they let an influx of Syrian refugees move into the country. About 1 million.
France, Sweden.
Yeah, France.
Yeah.
But Germany's the most salient, right?
Yeah.
This is why Angela Merkel had the lowest, essentially, percentage of votes she's had ever.
Almost lost the entire
party and
that she was
why
with.
a significant portion of their government is now, not a significant, but alarming amount, right, is now basically a neo-Nazi party.
Mm-hmm.
An influx of people creates that national identity crisis, right? And it's not restricted to any one state. It's not restricted to just white people. It's not restricted to Western, European, or United States or Canada. Right? This happens everywhere, right? This happened in Mexico with Haitians basically moving into Tijuana and most of Mexico, right? This happens with their very prejudiced towards Nicaraguans and El Salvadorians, that shithole of an area. And so this is not just, this isn't just idiosyncratic to white people, right? This happens everywhere. But the most salient one is places like Germany, right, where this causes that national identity crisis. And this is a problem with globalization, is that people need to be more careful with too much change happening all at once. Because what we see now is that people feel their nation state is essentially being threatened because you don't have the homogeneity that you need in a society, right? So Germany for German people, right? That's a slogan that you could very easily see.
So, based on what you just told me, does globalization destroy local cultures, or does it lead to like a resurgence in traditional cultures?
Yeah, it leads to, if globalization is done right, what it leads to is the integration of people into a secular society, right? And what I mean by globalization is I mean the movement of people into, you know, what we would traditionally call Western European values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Traditions of liberalism, John Locke, I mean,
Your founding
classical
fathers liberalism.
Yeah.
Yes.
So secularism, liberalism, you know, you don't have, you know, a state religion. It's just, you know, freedom of religion, things like that. Right. So when you move these people throughout borders, what you have is ideally is the integration of people into those values. And what you sadly see is you do see a sort of surge of identity politics, right? What you would ideally see is not the death of any sort of culture that you would have in that society, right? So a town like Fort Collins,
Mm-hmm.
if you have what at the most 160,000 people here,
Roughly.
right? You introduce 10,000 people from Bangladesh, right? What you would ideally see is not Fort Collins turning into, you know, a Bangladeshi community. What you would see is Bangladeshi food, you know,
See restaurants.
arts and
Yeah.
music and things like that, right? Things that we would genuinely value from a society, right? You know, differences of opinions. Hey, actually, we view things like this, but you know, we'd love to integrate it like this. And hey, have you tried this amazing liquor that we ferment? Right, we ferment it from this grass that only grows in the plains of Bangladesh, right? Whatever it is,
Mhm.
right? You know, that's what we would ideally see, right? Is the things that we would absolutely love to integrate into our communities. We have great seafood. We have Bangladesh is landlocked, but anyway, we have great cows that we cook, something like
You
that,
name
right?
it, yeah.
Whatever it is, but the food that we make is amazing, and look at all these spices that we're importing, right? Something like that that we would genuinely value.
Something that
And-
you can actually learn about that
Yeah,
culture.
exactly. And you know, maybe differences of opinion and ways to look at certain things, right?
A different view on the world.
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing to integrate into our community.
Mm-hmm.
But what we don't want, and this is again one of the problems with globalization and the left, is that what we don't want to integrate the shitty parts of a shitty community, right? So Bangladesh, right? Classic example, predominantly Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
What we don't want is 10,000 Bangladeshis to come and have their entire culture accepted. And okay, all of a sudden you're now murdering apostates. You're now murdering infidels. Somebody
Right.
like myself, right? Somebody
Yeah.
that makes countless jokes about Islam and Muhammad. And okay, well now, you know, I put out a blog or this episode, right? And okay, now I'm being hunted by 10,000 Bangladeshis that think it's okay to murder infidels.
Right.
Right? So that's what we don't want to integrate. And so it's not necessarily a resurgence of old cultures or that we want to see, you know, the way things are done die, right? Like those things we can celebrate throughout eternity. And that's what history is for. But what we also don't want to see is the bad parts of the society be integrated.
So it sounds like you're saying like we want to see the best of those cultures be integrated into our cultures.
Ideally, that would be the best way. But that rarely ever happens, right? So take Britain, or
Mhm.
not Britain, but England as an example.
They're
Right.
having some serious issues, especially with the Muslim
Yeah,
community.
and
there.
so you poll Muslims in London, I think it was. It might have been let's just say London just to be safe. But they polled them and they asked them, you know, what are your thoughts on gay marriage? 0%. You almost get no ubiquity amongst anybody, but 0% of Muslims in London, or maybe all of England, let's just say London to be safe, but they thought that homosexuality was, you know, an evil sin, and you know, they did not accept it. Basically, right? That is an alarming number. You don't get universality like that anywhere.
No.
But with that is an alarming number, and it's a failure of people in those societies to force Muslims to integrate and say, actually, we're a Western secular country. What we value is a range of opinions. And if you have a problem with that, that's fine. But what you can't act on that is, again, in law and, you know, personally, right? You can't go out and harass gay people, right?
Mhm.
And that is an example of globalization failing, right? We don't want the worst of societies to integrate so seamlessly into our society.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here, but basically, kind of how I'm interpreting what you're saying is under this umbrella of what you're saying, like the new left is that they are saying that we being like people like you and I, who maybe not necessarily abide by the ideals of the new left, or even just abide by. Anyway, we'll just stick with the new left. That we're essentially supposed to be forced to accept both the good and the bad that comes with a culture.
Yeah.
It's trying to essentially embed itself in a community, say Fort Collins, for example, that we have to accept the fact that they condone gay marriage and that they're okay with going up to the top of, let's say, the biggest tower in in Fort Collins and essentially throwing these gays off of the roof.
Yeah, and that's this is a problem because the left is essentially scared to call out. Not scared to call out, but they don't want to recognize any differences between cultures, right? According to the new left, and I think it's Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson basically calls it, the postmodern truth movement.
Mm-hmm.
Postmodernism is a movement amongst the left that basically saying truth is not objective, truth is entirely subjective. What you think is true is only based in the culture that you grew up in.
Sure.
Right? So with that line of thinking, nothing is wrong, right? How can anything be wrong? If truth is entirely subjective,
mm-hmm.
how is subjecting women to living an entire life in a burqa wrong?
Or even genital
Right?
mutilation.
It's just your own Western idealism that says that subjecting women is wrong, right?
Sure.
And so this is a position that the new left has adopted, and this is a position that is becoming mainstream. And so when you say, how can Muslims integrate into a society like Fort Collins? Well, if it was up to the new left, right, it would just bring the worst of Islam over, right? It would
Mm-hmm.
just, we would see women walking around in burqas, which we do see,
Yeah.
right? We see, women being segregated in their mosques, right? It's just, and, a lot of things that go on internally, right? It's just women are subject to half of their inheritance, all these things, right? And so, yeah, that is kind of the worst of the new left and of globalization is if you don't have a backbone and you're not willing to call out cultures and say that one culture is objectively, obviously better than other cultures, then you've lost the plot.
Mm-hmm.
You're fucked. Because we need to be able to recognize that, yes, some ways of living are better than other ways of living. That is as vapid a statement as I could say, but apparently this causes a lot of chaos within new left ideology, right?
Sure.
And so that's just something that we have to get over, and we have to recognize that, yes, yeah, some ways are better at existing and being than other ways, right?
I mean, it's easy to say, like, if we can go ahead and grab the Quran and make it better by just changing even a few passages, that should indicate to them right there that we can go ahead and make your life better.
Yeah.
I mean, that might be a little bit of an extreme example, but I feel like it's accurate.
Yeah, I could pick 5 passages in the Quran, and immediately we would see suicide bombings go away. We would see the subjugation of women go away,
Mm-hmm.
right? It would change a lot of the dynamic in wherever the Muslim community is, but not to get too distracted by what the problems with Islam, but
I think we could easily dive into that. But.
yeah, but just to hammer home the point about what globalization means, right? It's just globalization is basically on a tightrope,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a quote from Tolkien, but sway a little from the path, and you basically, what was Galadriel's quote? You're on the edge of a knife, and you stray but a little, and the entire quest is fucked.
Something
She's
like
talking
that,
to
basically.
Frodo.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what globalization is, right? You are on a knife's edge, and if you're not always brought back by rational thinking and reasonable thinking and secularism and all the things that make our society great, if you're not always brought back to those values, you're gonna fuck it up. And this is what the left is just seemingly determined to fuck this entire thing up, right? And we couldn't segue into Islam, but just to hammer home that point, like, we can't allow both sides to just fuck it up so badly for us that that we're just acquiescing to the worst of every other culture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Sorry, just I googled it real quick. It's because it was driving me crazy. The quest stands upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail to the ruin of you all. Yet hope remains while the company is true. So.
anyway, that's globalization.
Yeah, right there. Hey, thanks, Token.
Yeah.
No, but that absolutely makes sense. So I guess when it comes to, like, let's say third world countries, I can definitely see the benefit of globalization.
Yeah.
Look at Vietnam, I think, is a great example, because even though, you know, we went to war with Vietnam, they're a communist country, things like that, we've essentially applied globalization to Vietnam, and now even though there are sweatshops and people say, you know, sweatshops, people live in terrible conditions, but look at the benefits that's essentially brought to Vietnam.
And Vietnam is ostensibly still a communist country. It's classified as one of the 4 communist countries in the world, right? China is one, but not really.
China, Cuba,
Venezuela,
and
Vietnam.
But it's still, even the globalization aspect of things, of bringing like sweatshops and free trade and things like that to Vietnam, have actually really benefited a lot of the communities there. Singapore is a perfect example.
Is there a difference between Singapore people and, you know, Vietnamese people? They're all in the Mekong Delta, right? Just pretty much the same people. There's no difference.
The biggest difference, I think, is the fact that one's adopted capitalism, one's
right,
adopted communism.
exactly. And that was Neil Ferguson's point, and it's great. I don't know if I sent that to you, but it's worth watching, right? And he's saying the argument that I bring up there is that there's no difference in what we would consider race, right? There's no difference in there's not that drastic a difference between Singaporeans and Kenyans or something like that, right? Like,
right.
There's obviously one is black and the other is short, you know, Asian, right?
Yeah.
So the difference between a communist country and one that has adopted the values of the free market and capitalism is just day and night, right? One country leads the world in GDP, and the other one is a hellhole, right? And so, yeah, we globalization done right means that countries adopt values of free market, of hopefully secularization, but more importantly, the free market, and ditch socialism.
Yeah. Well, I guess Venezuela is another perfect example. I mean, you can see how terrible life is for the Venezuelans. Did you see yesterday that there was an assassination attempt on the president of Venezuela?
I didn't see that.
Yeah, so some Venezuelan, like, rebels or whatever, essentially, they got drones, and they strapped explosives to the drones, and they essentially just started to try to fly them towards a public speech that he was doing, and unfortunately they went off too soon. And I guess I shouldn't say unfortunately. I mean, I don't.
Unfortunately.
Yes. Let's be honest. It's unfortunate. But anyway, they essentially went off too soon, and the assassination attempt was a failure. But they essentially were trying to assassinate him, just because their life is such shit in Venezuela. I mean,
they don't have any money.
They have nothing.
Everything's the property of the state.
Yeah. It's crazy. But anyway, the point I was trying to make with, like, globalization in the third world country is you can't. How would you, like, say, like, the benefits that do come to a third world country with globalization?
Well, the benefits are measurable in every way, right? Quality of life instantly goes up, and not just incrementally. It goes up exponentially, right? And if so, mathematics, right? Incrementally, right? You have a chart, and this is your x, right? This is your y,
Sure.
right? This is your quality of life.
It's for those that can't see, he's doing essentially a XY graph.
Yeah, graph. And so that's incrementally, right? This x, y, this is exponentially, right?
Yeah.
So the numbers double because you're rounding to the power of 2, right? So life improves exponentially when you implement free market values and when you implement trade in any country, right? And this is measurable in the shittiest places on earth, places like Kenya, who border the Congo. The Congo, by every metric, is one of the worst places to live. Kenya could have been, just by extension, a part of the Congo.
Sure.
Right? There's no discernible border, right? It just so happened that Kenya adopted free market principles, and now Kenya is a thriving economy in Africa. It's not great, obviously. It still has a lot of problems.
Sure.
But Nairobi, hey, it's an economic hub, especially of Africa, right? And you do this with every comparable nation around the world, right? Look, the difference between, like we were talking about, Singapore and any other, Far East nation, right?
Vietnam, Burma.
Yeah, exactly. And you do this with China, for example. China, with Mao, adopted the Great Reform, and everybody, basically 50 million people died, right? Everything was the property of the state. It's one of the worst qualities of life, right? You start implementing free market principles. Granted, China is a very autocratic state, but it doesn't harbor any of the communist economic principles that it once did, right? Immediately, quality of life goes up. Immediately, free trade starts happening. Even
Second
within-
largest economy in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And because they have one of the biggest populations on the planet, but they started adopting free market principles. They started trading with other countries. They started being an economic powerhouse, right? One of the best economies in the world. And it's because they adopted the principles of the free market, the principles of globalization, where we're going to trade with other countries and it's mutually beneficial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so India did this as well. Their poverty rate shot down. Every country that adopts this and doesn't hold on to communistic or even feudal practices, right? Any country that adopts the free market, that globalization, and starts trading, their quality of life shoots up. And so that would just be a very salient example of how a third world country benefits from adopting globalization, right? And so, yeah, that'll just answer your question.
No, that's a perfect answer. I feel like we've kind of described both of our views on globalization, benefits, disadvantages, things like that can happen essentially with it.
So yeah, I would like to get your opinion. So,
Oh, sure.
when you see an influx of people into any society, and not just it doesn't have to be too many, right? So
Sure.
Syrian refugees, I think the U.S. let in the tens of thousands, right?
Somewhere in that ballpark.
It's not a massive influx of people, right?
When you're looking at 325 million with a couple 10,000, yeah.
Yeah. So what you see now, especially amongst Trump voters, right, is this sort of this identity where we're losing our identity. The U.S. is not for Americans anymore, right? So I guess I would just say, how would you respond to that? How would you say, okay, do they have a point? Are they exaggerating the point? Right? Is Sharia law that well poised to make a drastic influence in our society? And this isn't just. This isn't a small point, right? This was Trump's big. He still wants to.
Ban.
Yeah, he still wants to implement a Muslim ban, essentially. And so this was a big point for Donald Trump, right? And a lot of his voters, right? And so, I guess I would just say, how would you respond to that? How would you say, because of globalization, because of our sort of moral inclination to help Syrian refugees, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've allowed a lot of Muslims to come into this country, and now we get a bit of a backlash. Not a bit, a substantial backlash, because Donald Trump was voted into office, right? We now have a substantial backlash because of this identity game that a lot of Trump voters are playing, where we're like I said, we're losing our country, Sharia is going to take over, things like that.
It's a hard question because I see where people say like Sharia is going to take over, because it's kind of like something that we touched on earlier with, this is going to piss people off, but like with the whole new left, they're saying that we have to embrace these cultures, these ideas, and yet they don't. And I hate with the fact that the new left, there's so many people that are like, we need to have women's rights, we need to have equality, we need to have all these, people need to be able to not be seen as like a gay couple, but just as a couple, things like that, that there needs to be so many different things that are bound that essentially butt heads with Sharia law. So I feel like I see to an extent why some people are worried with that. People from Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan, things like that, people were, even Egypt, places that have high Sharia law belief
Muslim
systems,
countries.
that are coming into the United States, that they can see where they're worried about that being implemented, and the fact that I see there's a worry because the new left would probably try to embrace that because they don't want them to feel excluded, or they don't want to feel like we're not tolerant of their culture. So it makes it very, difficult. Like I could see, could see that being very hard for somebody, and I feel like that's probably why a lot of people voted for Trump, because they thought that maybe they'd be protected. We vote Trump in, he's going to keep those people out of the country, so we don't have to worry about Sharia law coming into into the country. But then again, who's to say that they're not even educated enough to know what Sharia law is? It's just maybe they're just so worried about Muslims coming in because people have been told for so long, like, that's the terrorist, and they're not wrong. And I think this is something that we should probably talk about too, because we've mentioned it in several different of our podcasts before, issues that we've had with the Muslim community, and I think that we should really probably focus on that, because you and I think, are probably well versed enough to talk about the different issues that come with the Islamic community. But to try to answer your question, I feel like people are worried because there's so many people that are trying to say we need to be tolerant of that culture. And that culture of people that embrace Sharia law essentially don't assimilate to what you and I believe, and that they don't have the same acceptance that we would have, being like, you believe what you want to believe, but let me believe what I want to believe. And I feel like a lot of people are worried that that's essentially going to be overlooked. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree, but I think you're a little too erudite in your
Okay.
analysis of this.
Okay, so let's break it down then.
So, I think you're being a little too intelligible in your concerns about people's concerns.
So dumb it down?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I think people's concerns, and you have 50 million evangelical Christians
Sure.
that were one of Trump's biggest base. Their concern is that Christianity is essentially going to lose out to Islam, right? And so I would totally agree with your concerns about the left, right? I would agree that the left is doing too much to make it extremely easy for things like female genital mutilation to happen, for the spread of basically proselytizing of Islam in U.S. jails and in impoverished communities, places like Minnesota, where we have a very big Muslim population. Those are concerns that I would share, right? But a lot of the concerns amongst Trump voters was just that, right? They weren't as versed in Sharia or Islam, that they have concerns that I would just not agree with, right? And that would be
essentially it would oppose upon their Christian
yeah,
beliefs.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Christian beliefs wouldn't be implemented. We would just have Muslims or terrorists everywhere.
They bought into that whole 9/11 essentially conspiracy of people believing that, like, all Muslims are here to blow up, towers, things like that.
Yeah, even just some Muslims, right?
Sure.
Things like that. So yeah, I think I would agree with your analysis, because I know much more about Islam than I think most people.
The average Joe down the street.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I think we do have to dumb it down a bit, and this isn't. But yeah, no, I legitimately think we have to dumb it down a bit, because it's just people are not that interested in learning, and
Sure.
I think we put ourselves too much in a bubble.
So yeah, I guess if we're going to dumb it down, we're going to put it from a religious aspect. I come from a religious background. I know that people believe that if you don't believe in Jesus, essentially you're dying and going to hell.
Yeah.
And I feel like probably a lot of the base Christians believe, like, Trump is going to keep them out of here so that we can still keep believing in Jesus, and we can still keep...
Yeah, Jesus is going to reign supreme.
Exactly. And, they don't want to feel like when they turn around the corner, there's going to be a mosque on every street corner.
Yeah.
And there are some concerns I've seen that probably are valid in the fact that, like, if you look at New York, sometimes during huge rush hour instances, there's so many Muslims that have been brought into that community that they've actually had overflow of Muslims going into the streets during prayer hours that has actually stopped traffic because...
That's on purpose.
Yeah, probably. I mean...
It's legitimately on purpose. It's meant to proclaim Islam as the dominant religion, call to prayer, things like that, right? It's meant to say, we're here, we're not going anywhere, and they're playing a generational game.
Yeah.
And we're playing a short-term game. They're here for the long haul. Their plan is a global society of Muslims, everybody that submits, right? And so, yeah, that is very intentional.
and that could be worrisome to a lot of people that see that, because they feel like, I think that that's going to be essentially something that imposes upon their beliefs. You know, people are very passionate about what they believe. People are very passionate about their religion, their ideologies, things like that, and that's something that scares them. And I feel like that's something that, you know, bringing in that many different people into the community frightens them, because, and I think the other aspect comes down to, they're worried about how they're going to essentially make a living.
Yeah.
Which I think is a valid concern, because I don't want my taxes or my dollars going towards something that I essentially don't agree with. But that could be another concern for them as well, because they could see like all these people integrating into the community, especially when you look at somebody like Germany, who has great, well, let's not say great, but they have huge social programs.
Yeah.
Very, you know, like, oh, okay. I mean, there's videos that you can go up on YouTube and see of essentially Syrian refugees coming into Germany and being handed stacks of money.
Yeah.
And that image is very powerful to somebody that sees that, thinking like, that could be my money going to a Syrian refugee, and now
Yeah.
I'm paying for them to live here, and they're not contributing to my economy, they're not contributing to my society or my community, anything like that. And that's a very powerful image, I think.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that can really resonate with somebody as well, because when it comes down to it, everybody can essentially relate to money. You know, like,
Yeah.
I don't want to pay for him to not work and while
Yeah.
I'm working. So I think it comes down to those two different principal aspects. People are afraid of the change that could essentially be bred with bringing in such a strong-minded community, and the fact that they feel like, well, I'm giving you money to not work.
Yeah.
Which might not necessarily
change
be the
my
case.
culture.
And change my culture.
Because
yeah.
a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the evangelical right, like you listen to people like Charlie Kirk,
Mm-hmm.
who I listen to a lot, his entire position was that the United States was founded on Judeo-Christian values. This is what people genuinely believe, right?
Right.
I would disagree heavily. You know, I've read a lot about the American Revolution, and I have a very, very good understanding of what they actually believed. But people like Charlie Kirk, modicumly, are right about the Judeo-Christian values.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we are a Judeo-Christian nation, but people, especially in the evangelical right, truly believe that in any sort of integration with Muslim people is degrading those Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah.
And so that is a genuine concern for them. And so we have to flip the script with them as well, right? Just as much we have to flip the script with the far left and tell them that for me, the name of the game, the plan is to have a truly secular society where what you believe doesn't matter to anybody. What you say, obviously with a few parameters, matters very little, right? It's just how you vote should influence how our society runs, right? And so that to me is the name of the game, right? Is secularism a society that is informed by science
Mm-hmm.
and not by the Bible or the Quran, right? That to me is the end goal, right? And so I do struggle sometimes to sort of sympathize with people that we might converge on the fact that I don't want more Muslims integrating into our society,
Mm-hmm.
but for entirely different reasons, right? And so
Yeah, something that we can talk on later. But sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, that was just my point was that we have to. People that I think have a good grasp of what Islam actually means need to be careful about making allies with the wrong people, right? We have to be careful about, I could totally agree with somebody like Richard Spencer and not allow more Muslims into the country.
Mm-hmm.
But me and Richard Spencer couldn't be more diametrically opposed in all of our worldviews, right? And so, we do have to pick and choose, and we have to be a little more careful as to our analysis. We have to kind of, dumb it down a bit when we're actually interpreting people's concerns, right? And
Yeah.
So that was just my point.
So, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to use the restroom. You can feel free to kind of expand on it, but I think we're going to go down a path here that we necessarily didn't write down here, but it's something that's kind of, it's getting me thinking like I think we need to expand on. So, Islam as a community, obviously, there's a lot of issues that come with that. And somebody that I necessarily don't agree with on a lot of different topics, but I still respect him to an extent. But somebody like Bill Maher, who I think is very, very liberal, but still has a good point of view when it comes to Muslims, Islam, things like that. And he's very smart when he says that, the things that they do, like the genital mutilation, throwing gays off of buildings, essentially, if a woman gets raped and there's not like 4 witnesses or something like that to prove it, essentially she can be stoned to death. Things of that nature that I think are very just terrible, and that I believe Islam is in need of a reformation, kind of like the Christians had during, what was it, the 14th, 15th century, something around that line. But the question I'm going to ask you is essentially how do you think Islam poses a problem to essentially not just the United States, but to other communities around the world? And what are the biggest problems that come with this? And why is it that the United States, and let's say the left in general, looks at Islam and says that this is something that we need to be tolerant of? Why do you think that is? And why do you think that we need to essentially look at communities like Syria that are having so many different issues and things like that, and be essentially helpful and take in refugees and things like that, when we see all the issues that come with places like Sweden and Germany and things like that? So, kind of a loaded question. There's a lot to it. If you want me to break it down a little bit more, I definitely can, but I'm just going to kind of let you go on that, because you're very well versed when it comes to Islam. I mean, there's probably nobody I know out there that knows more about it than you do. So I'm just going to kind of let you talk and roll on that. Yeah.
Should we use the bathroom quick?
Yeah. All right, so we're back. So if you need me to kind of repeat my question, just let me know. But otherwise, if you think you kind of remember, I'll let you just kind of
the threat of Islam. So a little bit of throat clearing, I guess. Islam is a entirely global religion. Their ambitions mean that if you take the most extremist view, the entire world should be a caliphate, right? And you should all submit and be Muslims, right? Muslim means one who submits, right? So Islam poses a unique threat to the West, and I use the West loosely based not because of Western European or the United States. I use the term the West for any country that has adopted, secularism, globalization, things that we've been talking about. So Islam poses a unique threat to these countries because it is playing a lifelong, multi-generational game where their goal is to establish this global caliphate. So this is a problem because Islam is antithetical to the West, right? The West, like I said, means secularization, means freedom of speech. It means freedom of thought, right? There's no thought crime. It means free press. It means the right to offend whoever it is that you want to offend. Islam is entirely antithetical to those principles. Apostates are killed, infidels are killed. If you're not a member of the book, right, a Jew or a Christian, you're killed. If you are a Jew or a Christian, you live your life as a dhimmi, right, second-hand citizen. And the treatment of homosexuals, for example, thrown off of roofs or hung if you're in Iran. If you're a woman, your opinion is basically worth half. Your inheritance is worth a quarter, right? You live your entire life subject to a plastic bag. You're in a giant black burqa. I don't know anybody who would admit that this is, a great way to live your life, right? And so, because Islam and the West are diametrically opposed, the two are just incompatible. Islam poses a unique threat to the West because people in the West get sloppy, they get complacent, and they say, actually, you know what, we've we've reached the pinnacle of society, look how great our society is. And they don't realize that always, 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 there are these forces that wish to destroy secular and liberal values. Always. Even within the West, right? Even within the West, you still had the rise of people like Martin Heidegger, right, the famous Nazi philosophist, right, people like Nietzsche, who was anti-democratic. You had postmodernism rise up in the West, very anti-Western, but still a Western tradition, right? So there's always, always people that are going to oppose, for whatever reason, secular liberal values, right? And Islam, because of the size of the religion, poses a very unique threat. There's 1.5 billion Muslims, right? And they're playing that multi-generational game where they don't care if, okay, my kids can not make any gains in your society in order for us to implement Sharia. Sharia translates to Islamic law. Sharia and law are synonymous, right? So we can implement Sharia. We can implement I'm drawing a blank. Ayaan Hirsi Ali calls the watch. Anyway, just the surreptitious behavior of Islamic theologians to proselytize, right? So Islamic theologians are playing this very surreptitious game where they are proselytizing. And you can see this now. They're proselytizing in prisons. If you pay attention to who's funding the Quranic prison, or Qurans that are spread in prisons, Saudi Arabia. They're spreading their most Wahhabist, we can get into Wahhabism, but they're spreading the most, Salafi, Wahhabi, very hard-line iterations of what the Quran means, right? Very hard interpretations, right? And they're spreading this. And this is going around in prisons. This is going around in communities like what we see in Minnesota, right? And so that is the threat. It's always this kind of looming threat that the West faces, because the West, people, like I said, get so complacent in what they actually have to defend, right? And you can see this in poll numbers. So Pew asked millennials, how important is it for you to live in a democracy? 20% say very important. That is a problem.
Yeah,
that is a very big
crazy.
problem. If you don't entirely believe, right? If you're not entirely convinced that living in a democratic state where freedom of speech is valued above everything else, you're fucked, right? That has to be your core principle. That has to be your operatus mundi, right? Like your mode of operation has to be freedom of speech, freedom of thought is the most important thing. From there, everything else happens, right? And Islam is antithetical to that. Islam does not allow for free speech. If you insult Muhammad, if you even draw a picture of the Prophet, right, you're fucked. You're killed. You're on a death list.
Yeah.
Right? This famously from the Muhammad cartoons with Charlie Hebdo to even not even drawing a picture of it, but just even talking about Islam in a book to what happened to Salman Rushdie, right, in the Satanic Rituals, right, that book that he wrote, which was sort of loosely based on Muhammad, right? You're fucked. You're entirely fucked. And so people need to get with the program and say democratic, traditions of secularism and liberalism are the most important things, right? And Islam does pose that problem where it's antithetical to all of that. And there are different ways in which both the right and the left fuck up that problem, right? And so the left is entirely focused on the game of identity politics, right? Where you're a Muslim, you're immigrated into this country, we're going to protect you because we feel like you're downtrodden, and look at all this Islamophobia that is happening in our country, right? What the fuck does that word even mean? It means absolutely nothing. It's a vacuous, vapid statement that means absolutely nothing. Islamophobia? Okay, that's ridiculous, right? We should be able to criticize the whole religion. The whole religion is just fucked. But we should be able to criticize it and not mean anything about the person or be bigoted against that person, right? And so the left and President Obama, as the most salient example, was playing that game, where he wouldn't criticize Islam, he wouldn't criticize Muslims for holding abhorrent views about the world, right? The left lost that game. Now, what you have is the other extremity, right? Because the left lost that game, now we have Trump, who's trying to ban every Muslim for coming into the country. They're losing that game. Why are they losing that game? Well, you poll Muslim communities, right? Rukmini, forgetting her name. She's a New York Times journalist. She did a great podcast called The Caliphate. She's talking to this guy who joined ISIS, and he's from Canada. The most
vanilla
unimportant country
Yeah.
ever. Okay, thanks for your maple syrup. He joined ISIS, and he's from Canada. And he joined ISIS because very, very popular proselytizers like Anwar al-Awlaki, right, the guy from Fort Collins, where we're at, he went to Colorado State University, he went to that mosque that was right there, right? He was proselytizing and saying, there's a war against Muslims, there's a war, and the Ummah, the Muslim community, they have to fight, and we're under attack. And sure enough, Trump, like the perfectly bad timing that he has, shows up and says, yeah, we're at a war with Islam. Great, thanks, guy. Now all these Muslims that are confused are saying, yeah, there's an actual war against Muslims. And sure enough, most of them go and fight ISIS. So Trump is also playing he's playing the role just horribly, right? Just as poorly as Obama played it, Trump is now playing that role poorly. I agree more with Trump, coincidentally, because I do think we need that sort of ban, we need something. We need to, at the very least, acknowledge that Islam is a problem. But this was a game that the left was just so uninclined to play, right? They were not wanting to even acknowledge that the religion of Islam was a problem, right? And so that's a very long-winded way to just say Islam poses that unique threat because they're playing that multi-generational game. And the way that Islam is structured is they're not going to give up. And we have to be just as committed to not giving up. We have to be just as adamant and just as fierce as a lot of Islamic theologians are. And the thing that a lot of us, right, and I say the word us tepidly because what I mean by us is people that value freedom of speech, freedom of thought, classic liberal values, right? We have to be just as fierce and adamant in defending those positions, and we can't have that vague, maybe this is worth defending or not. No, we have to be sure, and we have every bit of evidence on our side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, that was a long-winded way.
No, that was spot on. Now, the question that I was kind of thinking, or it sparked my interest when you were talking about all that, I'm going to start with the left, and then we can work our way on to the right. But how do we get the left to see the unique threat with Islam and to actually acknowledge it? And instead of trying to have this acceptance, this tolerance that comes with it.
They have to just, one, either read the Quran
Mm-hmm.
or read a summary of the Quran.
But the problem that we'll see with something like that is there's people that'll come, like let's say from a college community, where they took a course, and I'm going to say course in parentheses here, about how Islam is a peaceful religion.
I would say just read the Quran. Read the Quran. It's totally accessible online.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to Quran.com. It's a website. You can read it. It is translated by some of the Grand Muftis of Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
You can read it for yourself, just like the Bible, right? The Bible, if it is truly the Word of God, the Bible should be accessible to anybody.
Sure.
Right? If you were born on an island and you were abandoned by your parents and you somehow figured out how to read Latin, or you figured out how to read Greek, or you figured out how to read English, you should be able to read any sort of, any version of the Bible, right? You should be able to read the King James Bible, you should be able to read the Greek version. You should be able, if this is truly the Word of God, you should be able to read any version of that Bible. The same applies to the Quran, right? If you're a college student and you're curious,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and read it. There are many ways that you can get your hand in the Quran, right? And you can ask very serious questions. what does the Quran teach about gays? Well, let me take you to, let me take you to a verse here, right? It'll tell you, right? I'm drawing a blank on the actual names. Anyway, that's what I would say to anybody who would say Islam is a religion founded on peace. It is absolutely not. It is a religion entirely founded on the life and times of Muhammad, who was the last prophet of God, right? That's why we have the hadiths. Hadiths are basically the life and times of Muhammad, and people follow that, life and times and sayings of Muhammad. And people follow that as an example, as the best way to live your life, as one who submits.
Yeah.
Muslim means one who submits, right? And Muhammad, if you take his example and you're going to follow his life, had 9-year-old wives who he consummated his marriage with, Aisha. He murdered infidels. He murdered apostates. Right. The first caliph, right, Abu Bakr, was literally led the infidel wars, right? What they call the Ridda Wars, the first infidel wars. That he was going to say, "No, this is my territory. We're going to kill all of you," right? And so Islam, for the first 100 years or so, was entirely a religion based upon civil wars, right? They were trying to figure out who the next caliph, who the next ruler should be, right? This is why you have a Sunni Shiite split, because Shiite literally means proprietor of Ali, right? They were called Shiites of Ali because they thought that the fourth nephew of Muhammad or whatever it is should be the actual caliph, right? Versus the Sunnis who think that Abu Bakr was the rightful caliph, right? It is a religion entirely founded upon apostasy, murdering of infidels, wars, proselytizing, and conquering. Right? It's not a peaceful religion. A peaceful religion is something like Jainism, which is entirely committed to nonviolence. Right? And
so much so that you can't even step on a bug.
So much so that Mahatma Gandhi was influenced by Jainism to tell the Jews and write a letter to Hitler and tell the Jews, hey, actually go into the ovens. This is the best way to live your life. Go into the ovens, kill yourself, and maybe that'll make enough of a ruckus and the world will pay attention. Right? Mahatma Gandhi famously wrote a letter to Hitler and told him, hey, friend, I heard you're causing a hubbub over there in Europe, but the best course of action, please stop. That was Mahatma Gandhi's response to Hitler. Right? Obviously delusional, but if you really want a religion founded on the peace or nonviolence, Jainism is a religion. Okay, I'll believe you. Jainism is an actual religion founded on nonviolence. Islam is not. And there's not a single one. I challenge any lefty student to find me one actual scholar of Islam that will tell you this is a religion founded on peace or a peaceful religion. Right? It's not a peaceful religion. Right? So I would just argue, I would just tell people, if you are inclined to feel like religion or Islam is a religion of peace, please read the Quran for yourself. And it won't take you very many verses. It'll take you 10 minutes to even get into the worst verses, right? The first chapter, Al-Baqarah, the book about the cow. The 16th verse is jihad is, prescribed to you even though you might not like it, right? Holy war. It's prescribed to you even though you might not like it, and things that are prescribed to you, however the quote finishes, right? Holy war is prescribed to you. That is one of the main verses in Al-Baqarah. The first chapter in the book, you don't even have to get into an hour into it, right? And the first 90 verses are all about hating the Jews and how the Jews fucked up the world and all this other nonsense about fire and how everybody's going to burn in fire. It's not a peaceful thing, right? So that's how I'd answer people on the left who would be inclined to think this is a peaceful religion. It's not. Just read the Quran. Read it for yourself. Read it for yourself.
So, how did, and you might not know the answer to this, and I don't know where even it began, but how did the left buy into this facade, essentially?
Postmodern. So, I don't know if you know the movement of postmodernism. It was started, I think, by a few French philosophers. I'm drawing a blank on the name. I'm not a postmodern historian. But anyway, it was started by French philosophers and really adopted quickly by American philosophers as well, right? Who said, actually, truth is all subjective. There is no differences in culture. Everything that you experience is entirely, your truth is different than my truth, right? If you like ketchup, well, is ketchup really objectively better than mustard, right? Things like that, right? You can extrapolate all the way up, right? To, well, actually, you like killing women, but I don't like killing women. My point of view is a little different. Is your point of view really correct, right? In this entirely postmodern truth, or postmodern world, where a lot of philosophers now are calling post-truth, right? Where truth doesn't mean anything, it just means your own subjective experience, right? So the left adopted these values and said, actually, you know what, these people are right. My own subjective experience, because of all the influences of my society, of my culture, right? If a Muslim comes up and says, hey, I want to subject my wife to, you know, stay in her house until I give her permission, that's his opinion, right? He just grew up in the culture that he grew up in. There's no way for me to really objectively say, man, actually you're wrong, right? And so that's why the left is in the position that it's in now, because they objectively said there's no differences in right or wrong. Right or wrong is all subjective. Truth doesn't actually quite mean what we say it means, and who's to say that Muslims are wrong, right? So that's why we see now. We see just different iterations of that. It's just actually no, they're not wrong. So.
And it blows my mind how they've embedded themselves so much into this culture, and that they truly believe everything that they're saying about Islam to actually be accurate.
Yep.
And based on everything you even just said right there. So much that you see them walking down the streets of Washington, D.C. wearing burqas and things like that. It's something that I don't understand.
Yeah, the funniest thing was watching Linda Sarsour lead a women's resistance march, literally against Trump for his pussy-grabbing comments, and Linda Sarsour strapping on hijabs on women that were there to protest for women's rights. That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Literally the dumbest thing I've ever seen. How are you going to have, as the leader of your women's rights, a Muslim in full head garb? Literally, it couldn't... The best satire writers couldn't have come up with this type of irony, right?
No.
Like, you just... How are you so blind that you're so willfully missing the point?
Yeah.
And this is just apparently mainstream amongst the left, right? It's just, you're so blinded because you're not bothering to read. And this is what I find a little bit offensive and condescending about amongst the left, is I'm over here reading the Quran, reading everything that I can find about Islamic history, Islamic eschatology, everything that is the Quran and Islam, wasting hundreds of hours reading up on this stuff. And then I get some dumbass lefty person telling me, no, actually, that's not what the Quran says, or actually the Quran is actually peace, or actually Muhammad granted women's rights before anybody else. Like, no, you've obviously not put any effort into this, and you're just so happy with your own vision of what you think is right that you won't even bother to listen to what actual... I'm not calling myself a scholar, but there's true scholars of Islam, right? And people that have actually read on this stuff that will tell you very differently, right? And it's just, how are you so obtuse to a certain point that no argument gets through to you, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, that's crazy. And it's hard to say, too, now, obviously the left is being very hypocritical when it comes to this whole view, or their view when it comes to Islam, of being like, we need to accept them, their tolerance, we need to accept their culture, they're peaceful, things like that. So obviously they're very misinformed, but I feel like there's a lot of misinformation also when you look at the right as well, because they're looking at it as like, well, everybody's terrorists and they're here to try to blow us up.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's like, how do you defend either side at this point?
yeah, and it's hard for me to defend the right, because the right, the right, what I would consider the right, the left is postmodern nonsense, and the right to me is Christian evangelicals.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I view that
That separation.
dichotomy, right? It's
Yeah.
just, that's what it is to me. And the right is just as confused. They're not paying attention to what Islam actually means. They don't want them here. They're concerned about their own Christian values or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And they're not actually concerned with what I'm actually concerned with, right? And so the right, yeah, is just as delusional and concerned, but it just so happens, right, just through dint of luck, that the right is at the very least willing to acknowledge that Islam is a problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not just that Islam is a problem, but that, okay, we need to do something about it. And so, yeah, I would be a little more sympathetic to the right, even though they're totally wrong, just based on their measures, right? It's just, okay, Trump is actually talking about Islam, which is a problem, right? And so, yeah, the right is, I'm not a Christian, I'm not an evangelical Christian, right? I totally disagree with their worldview. But at the very least, they're willing to acknowledge that Islam itself as a religion is a problem. And they're willing to, I don't even know if they're willing to, but this is a good point, right? There is a distinction between ideas and people. And this is something that the left has not adopted. They don't understand it, right? You can have an idea, right? I can have an idea and I could be totally wrong about it, right? And I'm willing to, if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, your idea is totally wrong and this is why it's wrong, I don't want to be wrong for any longer than I have to be, right? And so the left is unable to distinguish that Islam is just a set of ideas. It's a book cooked up by 9th century philosophers in Syria, right? Or Jordan, most according to Tom Holland, right? Is that these were ideas cooked up by 9th century, 10th century philosophers. And they're not willing to distinguish the fact that Islam is a set of ideas between the Arabs that promulgate these ideas, right? And that's a problem when you can't draw a distinction between the ideas and the people that hold them, right? You are so quick, and this is why we see it, to adopt these values or think that people are being Islamophobic, and that is somehow synonymous with racism, right? Islamophobia is not on the same level as racism or even bigotry, right? Racism and bigotry I take very seriously,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think actual racists, people like Jared Taylor and Richard Spencer, which are the most salient right now, are actually terrible people. And when you can't draw a distinction between Richard Spencer and people like Sam Harris, who are critical of Islam, right, but are some of the smartest people, right, the most erudite people on this topic. When you can't draw a distinction between in your worldview, if you can't draw a distinction between the two, then you've lost the plot. You are confused, and how do we get you back to reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the biggest problem that the left faces, is that they can't draw that distinction between Islam as a set of ideas and people, the Arab people, Bangladeshi people, whoever it is that promulgates this idea, right? So, yeah, it's a huge problem.
Yeah. So, kind of hard to phrase this question, I suppose, but if you look at history as a whole, during, let's say, the time of the Crusades, 12th, 13th century, things like that, Islam was actually considered a very progressive religion at that time. They were very smart as far as mathematics, culture, writings, things of that nature. And yet it seems like when you look at their history that they have started taking a step back over time. How did that essentially happen? I mean,
But they never took a step forward.
Okay.
They never, a lot of what people would colloquially know as the Islamic golden age of science is over-exaggerated.
Okay.
Right? Very exaggerated. Right? It's just, it wasn't this time of secularism and science just brilliant, right? It just, a lot of it is exaggerated. One of the biggest contributions was optics that the Islamic scientists essentially put together. But the reason for this optics was because they thought every mosque should face towards Mecca. So, okay, you're 10,000 miles removed from Mecca, how can I get this mosque perfectly aligned to Mecca, right? And it wasn't this revolutionary thought in philosophy that they came up with. It was a lot of the translations that they kept, for example, in Baghdad, of Aristotle, of Plato, right? They conserved a lot of the Greek thought. And it was also, you also have to juxtapose that with what the Catholic Church was doing in those centuries. Right? The 13th century, very dark area for the Catholic Church. It was essentially just, that's why we call it the Dark Ages, right? There wasn't any sort of spark that could light the scientific revolution. A lot of it tried to happen, right? It tried to happen, but they just killed them, right? And Galileo was one of the first people, right, in the 15th century that actually said, hey, you know what, these are the moons of Saturn. What happened to Galileo? He was in prison for the rest of his life, forced to...
home arrest, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not like you can juxtapose Islamic society in the 13th century with some bastion of free thought anywhere else in the world, right? It was just both of these religions just cover the entirety of the world, and you're fucked. Like, you're just fucked if you're a free thinker, right? So it's an exaggeration to say that Islam was, going through these golden ages, right? It's just so people can feel better about themselves. Just, oh yeah, Islam was at some point, a bastion of free thought. It wasn't. It's just a false fact to say that about it, right? And yes, there was, I like a lot of early Islamic thinkers, right? Omar Khayyam, one of my favorite poets, fascinating poet to read, early Islamic thinker, right? And it's not to say that there wasn't, free thinkers in the Islamic society, but because of how the Quran is structured and because of how the Quran teaches people to structure their society, there wasn't any room for growth, right? And so it's not like Islam was ever, at this pinnacle where, hey, this is what an ideal Islamic society looks like, right? If you transplant a 13th century, 12th century Islamic society into today, it would look like the most autocratic, theocratic, right? It would be, North Korea would pale in comparison to what these Islamic theocracies would be, right? And so we tend to embellish how good these Islamic theocracies actually were, right? People were, like I said, there's the dhimmi status of Jews and Christians that have to live as second-hand citizens, right? And
look at Israel. Sorry, go on now.
Oh, yeah, no. But yeah, no, that is an embellishment of history to say that Islamic societies were going through this golden age, and that's just, it's not true, right?
Okay. So I have two more questions, and then we can kind of wrap it up. So based on everything you just said, and kind of to my previous question is, have you ever seen those pictures of looking at, and it might be just because Iran might be a very different, I don't know best way to phrase this, but it might be its own different problem all on its own. But if you look at like pictures of Iran from 1960 as opposed to Iran from today, it looks like they've essentially taken a step backward in time as well. Because if you look, you see people driving cars, women weren't wearing burqas, they're wearing dresses, things like that, looking very, I don't know, best way to phrase it, but maybe on par with the rest of the world as far as how, women dressed and things like that way. And then when you start looking at decade by decade by decade, all the way up into the modern day, it seems like each decade they've taken a step backwards in time. I mean, how would you explain that? I mean, how has it changed so much in that particular culture that it seems like they are just going back in time?
So this is a perfect example of how Islam and religion, this is Hitchens' quote, right, is religion poisons everything. Right? So Iran has never been a traditional Islamic country. Iran, essentially Persia, was way before Islam was introduced a Zoroastrian nation. And this is where Zoroastrianism came from. This is a very dualistic religion, right? There's good and evil, and you have opposing forces, and you can see this influence of Zoroastrianism kind of seep into Christianity, where people can't quite figure out what the devil is, what God is devil, just as equal as God, right? This is all Zoroastrianism, right? So if Iran or Persia has never fully bought into Islam the way that Saudi Arabia, the way that Yemen, the entire Arabian Peninsula has really bought into it, right? So always, always, always in Iran, there's this undercurrent of nationalistic pride, of Persian pride, of secular pride, really. And so what happened in Persia, right, just a quick synopsis, right? In the 1950s, there was, in the 1920s, basically the Shah of Iran was still the king of Persia, right? You had an entire kingdom of Persia for about 50 years, and then what you had was a nationalistic movement to implement a democratically elected leader in Mohammad Mossadegh. Right? He was elected leader of the nation, but he was very nationalistic. Right? He wanted to make oil a Iranian export. He said, no, everything Iranian is exclusively Iranian. We're not going to trade. So the U.S. had problems with this, right? And they helped to depose Mohammad Mossadegh. There was also a lot of Iranian problems, right? U.S. isn't this mastermind of, deposing leaders, right? I feel like people give too much credit to the CIA. But anyway, Mohammad Mossadegh was deposed, and the Shah of Iran was implemented again, right? I'm drawing a blank on his name. But anyway, the Shah was implemented. The Shah was a very cruel leader, killed a lot of people, right? 1970s roll around. Ayatollah Khomeini was first. He was banned from Iran, basically, and he made this grand entrance where a lot of the Islamists in Iran, because there was a very strong Islamist undercurrent in Iran, he deposed the Shah, right? You have the Islamic Revolution. But just to answer your question quickly, right, through the 50s to 70s, right, it was becoming a secularized nation, right? It was not under an Islamic theocracy. It was an autocratic theocracy, or autocratic rule, right? And it was trying to get trying to gain headway, right, into, women be able to wear skirts, right? You see that in a lot of pictures, right? A lot of, pro-Western liberal values that you see in these early 70s pictures, right?
Yeah.
And Iran looks like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah.
Right? And so in Iran in the 70s, there was this undercurrent of Islamization, right? Where Ayatollah Khomeini was very popular, and he was going to lead a revolution in Iran to depose the Shah, and a lot of the Islamists loved him, right? So 1979 happens, Ayatollah Khomeini wins, deposes the Shah is exiled, right? Ayatollah is implemented as the Grand Leader, and so as the Grand Leader starts to impose all of these Islamic laws, you start to see the regression of that society, right? Where before there was this notion of secularism, because there is a lot of Iranian scholars and journalists who were very pro, Western, right? There's people like, I have all their names written down. I'm trying to blank it, it's hard to pronounce. But anyway, there was a lot of Iranian thinkers that were very pro-Western. They would read people like Karl Popper, right? And Laura Sikora. I have that book right there, Children of Paradise, which talks about the entire intellectual movement under the Ayatollah, right? They were talking about we want to be pro-Western, and a lot of them thought that Islam could be reformed into a modern society, right? They would read Karl Marx, so you have Islamic Marxists, right? They thought that, it's entirely compatible to have an Iranian society be Islamic and be Western at the same time, right? And so a lot of these intellectuals were murdered, a lot of these intellectuals were jailed, and you started to see very hardline thinkers get into the head of Ayatollah Khomeini and then his successor, Khomeini. And so that's why you see the regression of Iran, right? Where Islam is implemented, you start to see the regression of societies, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you see now, and that's happened through the decades, right? Where Islam or Iran is a very nationalistic, very proud of their Persian background, but because there are so many hardline Islamic thinkers that they've entirely decimated the society, right? They've killed all of, or exiled all of the popular thinkers, right? All of the popular journalists. They're all basically gone. They're fucked, right? And so all you're left with is hardline Islamic thinkers running the society, right? And so that's why we see the degradation of Iran. And Iran, sadly, and this is one of the good things that Trump is doing, he's supporting Iran. He's telling the entire theocracy of Iran to go fuck themselves. And that's a good thing, right? Where he came out with that Rouhani, he was basically telling him to go fuck himself.
Yeah.
Right? He was saying, like, if you're going to fuck with the U.S., like, you're not going to fuck with the U.S., right? And so this gives Iranian people a lot of hope. And you see now all of the protests that are going on in Iran, right?
Yeah,
and so
it's getting crazy.
And if that isn't a clear indication of how Iranians want to just throw away all of the Islamic nonsense that has been imposed upon them and just want to be Persians. They would just want to have their own secular national identity, right? It's just that I couldn't have a better sign for what is happening actually in Iran, right? And just because there's so many hardline Islamic theologians in power, you've just seen that society completely regress, right? So yeah.
Well, your last little bit there, I guess, kind of does segue into my last question that I have. So in like the 16th century, Christians had essentially a reformation with their religion, you know, because previous to that they had obviously the Crusades, things of that nature. I mean, Christian religion was pretty messed up until, well, anyway, that's a whole other topic we can go down. But anyway, so with everything that's going on in like Iran and stuff like that right now, and like you said, they want to essentially embrace being Persians, things like that. How could we get, and this is a very hard question because I don't know if there is a right answer to it, but how could we get Iran to essentially have, or not Iran, but Islam to have some kind of reformation so that it truly can be a religion that actually has peaceful practices, things like that? I mean, is that something that you foresee actually even being possible?
I don't foresee it as being possible, and I think the word first, the Reformation, is misused. The Reformation, if you study Martin Luther, was not a Reformation to be less pious and be more secular and be more liberal. The Reformation of Martin Luther posted his 95 Thesis on the Catholic Church,
right,
and said, "You're selling out. You're buying basically salvation for people. You're trading salvation for gold." And Martin Luther said, "Nope, that's not right. Right? You can't just trade gold and allow people to save their souls for however much gold you want to trade for." Right? And Martin Luther's big statement was sola fide. Solely through faith can you actually can your soul be saved, right? So the Reformation is a misnomer because it's not a reformation of Catholicism. It was essentially Martin Luther saying, you're not doing enough for God, and I want to be more hardline. And Martin Luther was crazy. He was legitimately crazy if you read what he actually said, right? And so I don't think there should be a reformation where all of a sudden we have thousands of denominations of different Muslims, right? Because that won't work either. The substantial difference between Christianity and Islam is that Christianity has a small passage that says, do unto Caesar as you would do unto Caesar, and do unto God as you would do unto God, right? Basically giving you permission to behave as a citizen of the country and still hold your faith. And this is exactly what we see through every evangelical denomination or every Christian denomination throughout the country, right? People say, oh yeah, my faith means everything, but I can still be a citizen of this country, right? I can still vote, I can still do all these things, right? But my faith means everything to me. And how can you behave or act throughout the dichotomy? Well, it's because of that line, right? And so Islam doesn't have that line, right? It says, in order to be a citizen of any nation, right, you have to follow the Quran, you have to follow Islamic values. So I see it as a doomed effort to try to to try to suggest that there should be some kind of secularization of Islam. What we need is a truly concerted effort to promote anti-Islamic values, or just sort of secular liberal values within Islamic countries, because they do exist and they do happen. They're in the tens of thousands now, right? But we need to promote these people, right? We need to promote people like Raif Badawi, right, who's the most famous blogger of Saudi Arabia, who's been in prison for thousands of days for literally saying nothing more than we should take a look at the Quran, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to promote people like that, right? We need to promote people like Faisal al-Mutar, who's from Iraq, who a great secular thinker who, made it out of Iraq, but is a secular thinker nonetheless, right? He's trying to promote liberalism and secularism in Iraq, in a very Islamic society, right? And we need to promote people like that who are going to say, you need to think very differently about your worldview, and you need to change your ideas of what Islam means, right? And so I don't think it's going to take an analogous movement of the Reformation. I think we need to create an entirely different movement, and it's going to hopefully go down in history, but we need to create an entirely different movement where Islam is valued less and less, and secularization and liberalism are valued much more.
How do we get people on board with that?
Through conversation. Through, because people are very good at adopting good arguments, right? If you present a strong enough argument, people are going to be persuaded, right? You're kind of a slave to your own reason. And so we just need more conversations. Like, I don't know if you paid attention, a few years ago, right, there was an entire atheist movement with Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, and Richard Dawkins, where people in the comfort of their own homes, right, of YouTube, and you could just sit there, watch, be influenced by people just talking, right? And that needs to happen worldwide. That needs to happen throughout the entire Islamic world, where very popular people, right, we need these videos, these debates, these conversations to happen by the tens of thousands, where we are changing societies, right? Debate and conversation is actually changing people's minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need to do, where we need it to be less taboo to change your mind. We need to have people open to discussion, right? So that's how you do it. I think that's the best way to do it.
So I'll make this the final question. It's a very short answered question, but so you're very, very well read on this topic. I mean, I know this is something that you've been very passionate about in the years that I've known you. This is something that you and I have talked about multiple different times. So, and it'll probably be hard for you to narrow it down to just 3, but if whoever's listening to this podcast, they wanted to find out more about some of the different topics that we've been talking about tonight, when it comes to Islam, maybe even globalism, things of that nature, do you have any books or any authors or anything like that you'd recommend that people actually read or research or anything like that to actually find out a little bit more?
Yeah, there's 3 books, and I can let you borrow them, but there's 3 books that I would absolutely recommend to people. One is Will McCant's book called ISIS Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a 200-page book entirely dedicated to Islamic eschatology.
Okay.
Eschatology means end times, right? So you can very easily see how entities like the Islamic State, ISIS, are behaving and why they're behaving, and it will kind of clear any doubt that people who are Muslim are not influenced by the Quran, which I think is kind of a misconception, right? I'm a Muslim, but I'm not influenced by the Quran,
mm-hmm.
right? That's what people on the left seemingly think, right? So Will McCant's book on ISIS will put to bed any of those doubts, right? So that's the first one if you want to learn about the Islamic theology and Islamic eschatology. The second book is Steven Pinker's Enlightenment, right? If there was ever the perfect argument for why liberalism, secularism, the tool of science, right, and progress actually works, right? If you're trying to figure out, well, actually, why is one nation better than another nation as far as GDP, as far as quality of life, that's the book, right? It's Steven Pinker's Enlightenment now. And the third book is Christopher Hitchens' Letters to a Young Contrarian,
mm-hmm.
right? If you're ever trying to figure out how to think for yourself, how to not be a part of groupthink, that's the best book. It's about 100 pages. It's 13 different letters to tell you, actually don't follow groupthink, right? Just think for yourself. This is how you're going to be able to. It's basically teaching you how to think and how to not follow groupthink. So
Just basically form your own opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Cool. Well, that's all I have. So, I mean, if you have any other final thoughts or anything like that you want to throw out there, feel free.
I think that was good.
Okay. I mean, this didn't go necessarily down the course that I think we were originally thinking it would go down, but I think it was still good. It was still good information for people to hear.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things that I feel like a lot of people are very, I don't know, misinformed is the right word, but a lot of people have essentially a lot of public views on these different topics that you and I have been just talking about right there, and maybe a misconception of like the public view of things.
Yeah, and it helps people. I don't know who's going to listen to this, but it helps people who are very smart and are actually scholars. It helps them realize that their arguments make a difference, right? Like we're not scholars. We're not going to be tenured at any, academy anytime soon.
Yeah.
But we can still adopt those arguments and still make very good arguments for why we're going to vote the way that we are and influence our society in the way that we are, right? And so, yeah, we might not be. I might not be making the smartest argument for any position that I've argued for, right? But I can still, I think, get away, right, with making good arguments, right? And that's what's important. It's important for people to realize that conversation actually works, right? And that listening to conversations actually works, right? So I used to think very differently than I think now, right? 4 years ago, you would have caught me, on the frontier of the far left, right? Just being very, you're racist, all these things, right? And it just so happens that conversations have actually helped me change my mind, right? And so that's what I think this podcast is such a good testament to is the power of conversation and being influenced and just hearing people. And it doesn't have to be the smartest people, or I'm not the smartest person by any means, right? It's just, but I can still just, at the very least, hopefully I can just nudge somebody to learn more, right? And that's what I think this podcast is so important for. It's two people that are well read, but we're not scholars, but at the very least we can make good arguments for things, right? And hopefully that just that keeps the conversation going, right?
Yeah, and then we're not going to come across as those people like, you'd see like, oh, that's that redneck over there that's just saying that like they're taking our jobs and they're blowing up our cities type thing. That we're coming from a point of like, we've studied this, we've at least listened to the actual arguments, we've made up our own opinions of things. So,
yeah, definitely.
All right, well, I appreciate your time, Jerry. It's always fun when we get to do this. Our next few, it sounds like, are going to probably try to be like Skype or virtual or something like that. So that'll be a new challenge for us to try to figure out how to do. But anyway, man, I appreciate it. I don't have any final thoughts, so if you have anything, feel free to throw it out there. Nope? All right.
We're pretty drunk, so I don't know anything I've said.
Yeah, right. At this point, I think this was like 3-4 gin and tonics in.
Yeah, half a bottle of gin.
Something like that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for listening, and thanks for being offended with us, guys.